Paul, Apostle of Christ stars Jim Caviezel, James Faulkner, Olivier Martinez, Joanne Whaley, and John Lynch, and it is directed by Andrew Hyatt. And this is the story of, as you might guess, Paul, Apostle of Christ, and it mostly centers upon Luke, who wrote the book of Luke and Acts in the New Testament of the Bible, coming to Rome to talk with Paul and meet with the Christians hiding in there because the Emperor Nero has burned down half of Rome, blamed it on the Christians, and they are being persecuted to the extreme in some pretty horrific ways that we do see on the screen and is fairly disturbing. And like I said, Luke, played by Jim Caviezel, which is kind of funny because he plays Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, and he's going to reprise his role as Jesus in the sequel follow-up film, which Mel Gibson is creating. But anyways, the characters are still seemingly fairly different, of course, but it does seem a little funny. Anyways, he comes to visit Paul, who is in prison awaiting execution at the hands of the Romans, and it's all about Luke getting Paul's story and writing it down to put into what we know today as the Book of Acts. And there is a side plot, a fairly main side plot, I guess you could say, that really incorporates with this plot about Olivier Martinez's character. He plays this Roman soldier whose daughter is sick, and he has this crisis of conscience whether to rely upon his pagan gods to help save his daughter or whether he should rely upon Luke. So let's talk about the production value of this movie. I was fairly impressed with the production value. I really didn't know what to expect. This is a Sony funded movie, so I assumed the budget would be fairly good, and thankfully the costume design and the sets were all fairly believable. It looked fairly real. So I was thankful for this production that didn't look cheesy, that didn't take me out of it, but it did feel pretty real, and I was glad about that. Now, as for the story, I thought the story was fairly well done. Let's talk about some positives first. The character of Paul I thought was very believable as Paul, and Jim Caviezel as Luke. They did have some great on-screen chemistry, and especially Aquila and Priscilla. Those were nice characters, and you could really tell there was some tension going on in Rome. It was a really scary time, and I definitely felt that, and I was glad to be able to see that portrayed on screen, because in the book of Acts we know that these Christians are heavily persecuted, but it really doesn't go into detail. So seeing it in this movie really does give you a sense and a really nice atmosphere for what the early Christians were feeling and going through at the time. So I did feel myself drawn into the story in that way. Some negatives with this are it does get fairly slow in the second act, I would say. It has a strong first act. The second act kind of feels like it's just filling time. This movie could have been cut down. It's an hour and 50 minutes. It probably could have been served better as an hour and a half. So take out some of those extraneous scenes and kind of tighten up the story a little bit. Also, I felt like, especially during the second act, we kind of lost focus with Paul. It seemed more to focus on different things, and I felt like we didn't get as much of Paul's story as I was hoping for, because this takes place right at the very end of Paul's life. So we just really get a pretty good detail of his very early ministry, and that's basically it, and just him in prison, of course, in the present day scenes. So I was a little disappointed we were not focusing as much on Paul and telling the story, because that's what the title of this movie is. Other than that, the story is pretty good. I was fairly impressed. I was glad they didn't make this cheesy. I know some Christian movies tend to be kind of cheesy with a pretty mediocre production, but this one is not one of that. I will say the Passion of the Christ production is better than Paul the Apostle of Christ. Okay, let's talk about the cast. Jim Caviezel does a pretty good job. Yeah, I was impressed with Caviezel's performance. The guy who played Paul, James Faulkner, very impressed with his performance as well. Those were definitely the two standouts in this movie with their performance. Everybody else, Aquila and Priscilla, I can't remember, they were the other standouts as well. I thought they really did great with kind of giving two different views of what Christians should be doing in times of severe persecution. Olivier Martinez, I felt like didn't work very well in this movie. yeah, certain parts he did work, but otherwise I felt like his performance was fairly flat. He didn't offer a lot of emotions when I felt like he should have been. He was playing opposite his wife, who gave a great emotional performance, and he just wasn't giving me anything. Some no, like a few more negatives is, like I said, I found myself just kind of losing interest, especially with this side plot that I felt was far too focused on and was far too long. They definitely could have tuned that up a little bit, and I was clock watching a little bit. Also, with some of the emotionality, I think they could have amped that up because they had it strong in the beginning. Like I said, it kind of lost itself in the middle, and but the very end really did tie itself up emotionally in a very satisfying way. And honestly, it's a tearjerker. So this movie is good. I wish it would have been great, but nevertheless, I do feel like we need to support these movies that are telling these ancient stories that are still very applicable to our lives today. And I love seeing these biblical movies portrayed on the screen that used to be huge in Hollywood with those huge biblical epics. This one stays fairly close to the New Testament account. It does add a few things, but just for that theatrical element and, of course, to fill the runtime. But, anyways, I do think we should support these movies. I thought it was fairly well done. I think the next movie they can do concerning the New Testament or possibly even Old Testament that does stick true to it, I think they could do just a little bit better. I would like to see that happen. But, anyways, it's a good movie. I'm giving Paul, the Apostle of Christ, 7 stars out of 10. It comes with a solid recommend still. So, thank you so much for watching with this review. Please give this a thumbs up and a subscribe. Share with your friends. We love talking with you guys here on Silver Screen Guide. Make sure to be on the lookout for some more great content. We'll catch you next time.